Sewing a two-piece placket. A two-piece placket is a placket that is used most commonly on sleeves. Learning the process of making a two-piece placket will definitely help you while stitching a shirt. Objective? At the end of this class, you will be able to stitch a two-piece placket. Let us first familiarize with the tools and materials that you would need to stitch a two-piece placket on a sample piece of fabric. You would need cotton fabrics, pattern square, straight ruler, tailor's chalk, pins, shears, a pair of small scissors, contrasting threads, hand sewing needle, iron box, measuring tape, seam ripper, and sewing machine. Now let's watch how to stitch a two-piece placket on a sample piece of fabric. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out required sample fabric pieces. Measure and mark 10 inches by 6 inches squares on a double layer of cotton fabric with the help of a pattern square, measuring tape, and a tailor's chalk. Cut the marked area using shears. These are the outer pieces. For the facing piece, draw a 7 inches by 2.5 inches and 7 inches by 1/3 inch square on a single layer of different color fabric for the facing. Use shears to cut these squares. Please note, we're using a different color fabric for the facing piece for demonstration purposes only, otherwise we would use the same fabric as the outer piece. Step 2. Mark the seam lines. Mark a seam line along one long edge on the wrong side of both the facing pieces with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Step 3. Pin smaller facing to one fabric piece and baste. Take one sample piece and pin smaller facing 7 inches by 1/3 inch on the right-hand side with right sides of fabric together. Baste along the seam line. Step 4. Stitch on the seam line and remove basting. Start stitching with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Then stitch on the seam line up to 6 inches length, leaving 1 inch unstitched. Lock the stitching at the end with the reverse stitches and snip the threads. Remove the basting using seam ripper. Step 5. Fold and iron the facing piece. Fold the raw edges of the opposite side ½ inch to the wrong side of the facing and iron. Now fold the facing piece inside to the wrong side of the outer piece. Iron the folded piece. Step 6. Stitch close to the edge. Then stitch close to the edge up to the length of the seam line from the right side of the fabric. Step 7. Pin bigger facing to other sample fabric piece and baste. Take the other sample piece and the bigger facing, 7 by 2½ inch, with the right sides of fabric together along the long left side. Pin and baste along the seam line. Take pins out after basting. Step 8. Stitch along the seam line and remove basting. Starting with reverse stitches, stitch along the seam line up to 6 inches length, leaving 1 inch unstitched. Lock the stitching at the end with reverse stitches and snip the threads. Remove the basting using seam ripper. Step 9. Fold, iron, and pin the sample pieces for stitching. Fold and iron the raw edges of the opposite side ½ inch inside of the facing. Bring the folded edge to the made seam line by folding it to the wrong side and iron. Keep it in place with pins. Place the two sample pieces one over the other with right sides together. The sample with bigger facing has to be on top. Join them on the remaining unstitched seam line. Pin the two layers to keep them in place. Step 10. Stitch the sample pieces together. Remove the pins. Then stitch with machine on the seam line. At the end of the remaining seam line, turn the sample 90 degrees and join the two facings. Lock the seam with the reverse stitches. Step 11. Hem around the folded edges and remove pins. Trim 3/4 inch of the smaller facing piece at the loose bottom and fold the raw edge at the bottom of bigger facing. Open the sample pieces with wrong side up with the bigger facing on top of the smaller facing. To hold it, fix it with pins. Now hem all round the folded edges. Snip the threads with a pair of small scissors and remove the pins. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned. You have learned the way to stitch a two-piece placket. Let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out required sample fabric pieces. Step 2. Mark seam lines. Step 3. Pin smaller facing to one fabric piece and baste. Step 4. Stitch on the seam line and remove basting. Step 5. Fold and iron the facing piece. Step 6. Stitch close to the edge. Step 7. Pin bigger facing to other sample fabric piece and baste. Step 8. Stitch along the seam line and remove basting. Step 9. Fold, iron, and pin the sample pieces for stitching. Step 10. Stitch the sample pieces together. Step 11. Hem around the folded edges and remove pins. You have now learned how to stitch a two-piece placket. Take our next class to learn how to stitch a two-piece placket for petticoat and skirts.